Okay, so yeah, as I say, we can get started. So we're very lucky to have our next speaker in the IPMC seminar series. So we're very lucky to have Dr. Monima Chadha. So Monima is a senior lecturer at Monash University in Melbourne, in Australia. Her research focuses on cross-cultural philosophy of mind, specifically classical Indian philosophy and contemporary Western philosophy of mind. And she's at the forefront of research to integrate insights on mind, consciousness, and the self from across these philosophical traditions and also the cognitive sciences. So her work has been published in leading philosophical journals, and she's just finished a book on selfless minds, which looks at the metaphysics of Vasubandhu, a kind of Buddhist no-self doctrine. And this is published by Oxford University Press. And so in this book, I think we can see Monica's kind of pluralist approach. So she combines, insights from the text by Vasubandhu, but also contemporary approaches to philosophy of mind, phenomenology, as well as some evidence from cognitive science. So it's very much our pleasure to welcome you, Monima, to our seminar series. So today I think you're going to speak to a chapter from the book, is that right? So you're going to tell us about agency, who is morally responsible, and this is from this kind of no-self perspective. So everybody please join me in welcoming Monima Chadha.
Thank you. Thank you. Oops. That's great clapping. Thank you. Okay, so this is not a chapter from the book, Chris. It's going beyond the books, so we can move to the next slide. So what I want to do in this paper, I'm going to hopefully talk for not more than 45 minutes, is I want to raise a challenge for Buddhist philosophy, but I think it's the same thing is also a challenge for contemporary philosophy. So they don't notice it. So I'll tell you what I call the responsible agency challenge. And then I'm not going to try and solve the challenge. So it's not just a problem for the Buddhists. It's a problem for contemporary philosophers as well. And I'm not going to give you, how the Buddhists can get over the challenge here. What I'm going to say is I think it's a serious challenge, and that requires some revision of our ordinary interpersonal practices. I make some room for that revision and then tell you the kind of revision I am looking at. So next slide. So the next one. Here's the problem and background. Here's my hero, even though the book, this is not a chapter from the book, but it's the same philosopher, Vasubandhu, very important figure in Indian Abhidharma philosophy. He wrote the first authoritative text in Buddhist philosophy, in Abhidharma philosophy, and then he's also known to have changed his mind so many times. There's a live debate in Indian philosophy whether this is one person or two persons. But, in philosophy, people do change their minds, so we're not going to be worried by that. I think it's the same Vasubandhu. He just becomes more sophisticated. So these are the two texts I will be looking at, Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya and a later text called Karma Siddhi Prakaran. Next slide. So here's the problem for the Buddhists. So the Buddhists seem to be committed to two things, the no-self and the karma, doctrine of karma. Karma, I think, is best thought of as moral causation. Good and bad actions result in pleasant or painful consequences for the agent in the non-immediate future. So two important things here. Of course, it's a doctrine of, moral consequences for the agent, good consequences for good actions, bad consequences for bad actions, but it's like a causal doctrine. So think of the law of karma just like gravity. If I have this bottle cap and I drop it, there's only one way it's going to go, down, because of gravity. And karma works like that. You do an action, whether anyone observes or not, you are going to suffer the consequences of the action. But in the future. And the future, of course, could be many lifetimes because the Buddhists believe in rebirth. I'm not going to talk about that, but I'm happy to answer questions. So given that view of karma, that there will be consequences of actions in the immediate future, and given that the no self view implies there is no agent of action, at least Vasubandhu's no self view in chapter 9 of the Abhidharma Kosha implies there's no agent of action, there is no owner of experiences, and there is no identity over time. The agent and the experiencer, there is no identity. Next slide. It seems that without a self, there's going to be nothing to serve as an agent, there's going to be nothing to serve as an owner of experiences, and there is going to be no identity between the agent and the action. So, if karma is about moral responsibility, karma is the doctrine that plays the role of moral responsibility, it seems that given clause 3, we need to answer the question, who is morally responsible? That's the question I want to focus on. That's the problem I'm focusing on here. Next slide. So the background for this problem comes from the Hindu argument for the self. The Nyaya Vaisheshik, one of the Hindu schools, give this simple and very elegant proof for the self. It says desire, aversion, volition, pleasure, and pain. These are the characteristics. You can think of them as the marks of the self. They're the marks of the self, and they come together very nicely in the conception of an agent. The Nyaya conception of self is that of an agent. An agent has a certain desire. The desire leads to a certain kind of volition. You make up your mind to do a certain thing, and you do a certain action. And if it's morally good, you will, because of karma, have some pleasure in the future, have pleasurable experiences in the future. Nyaya philosophers want to use, such an inference to the best explanation to posit a self in the background of the karma theory as a substantial, persisting agent, which has all these properties. Desire is a property of the self, pleasurable experience is a property of the self, and this substantial, persisting agent is the Nyaya question, a Nyaya answer to the question, who is morally responsible? It's the self. So this self is the bearer of moral responsibility. What about our friend Vasubandhu? Next slide. So Vasubandhu's focus in chapter 9 of the Abhidharma Kosh is these Nyaya philosophers. So here is, kind of my reconstruction of a dialogue between Vasubandhu and the Nyaya philosopher. So here's what the Nyaya philosopher says: there being no self, who is the doer of the deeds and who is the enjoyer of their fruit? Vasubandhu says, what is the meaning of doer? Well, the doer is someone who does, and the enjoyer is the one who enjoys. Vasubandhu doesn't like this. That's just giving us synonyms. You have to explain the meaning of these terms. And then comes the important Nyaya claim, which is kind of, something that the Nyaya borrows from Sanskrit grammar. And it says the doer is the one who is autonomous. For example, Devadatta has the power in relation to, bathing, eating, and walking. He's the one who's called the bather, eater, and walker. The agent is the one who's autonomous, who makes the decision, okay, I will get up and have a bath. Vasubandhu says this definition is not acceptable. Doer as autonomous. Why not? Next slide. Because Vasubandhu says the question is, what is meant by this phrase, Devadatta? What does the name refer to? What's the reference? If you mean the self, the autonomous self that the Hindus are positing, that's the example is useless. This is a debate about the self. We cannot, we cannot take the self for granted. We haven't established it as yet. If it is the complex of the 5 psychophysical aggregates, so the skandhas or the mental states and physical states, then Devadatta is an agent. That's fine. But, there is no autonomy because mental and physical states are not autonomous. Mental states get affected by physical states. If there is a sensation of hunger, that makes me go to the fridge and see if there's something to eat, or thirst, then I'll go to the fridge again and see if there's some water. Next slide. So mental and physical states cannot play the agent role. And so Vasubandhu's reply, now this is the more important reply that Vasubandhu gives: no doer characterized as autonomous is apprehended. There is no such doer given in our experience. That which is the dominant cause of something is called its doer. But the self is not found to be a cause with respect to anything, because the things that are doing the work are the mental and the physical states in the explanation of action. Therefore, there cannot be a self. And in the last sentence, what you get is Vasubandhu's explanation of action. From recollection, there is interest. From interest, there is consideration. From consideration, there is willful effort. From willful effort, vital energy, and then action. So what does the self do here? So two things are going on in this quote. First, Vasubandhu is giving you an explanation of action which does not implicate a self, a new reconceptualization of action. And that's kind of contained in the sentence, that which is the dominant cause of something. So we have to find out what is the dominant cause of an action. So I'm going to use an example, say stealing a mango. So here's the idea. You're in an Indian market. At the end of summer, there are mangoes on the carts everywhere. The mangoes are absolutely delicious. The weather is awful, but the mangoes are worth going to India for. This is about May, June. That's when you need to be there. You can smell the mangoes. You had it last time you were visiting India. So from recollection, there arises an interest. Interest to somehow procure the mango. From interest, consideration. You put your hand in your pocket and look for your wallet. Unfortunately, you've left your wallet at home, at the hotel. It's your last day in India. You're not going to get this chance of having this mango. You get on a flight this evening. This is your only chance of getting the mango. You decide willfully, you decide to steal the mango. From that decision, and if you're like me, you don't steal that often, comes this nervous energy, vital energy, and from that bodily action, I grab the mango and run for my life. There's got to be a lot of people from the market running after me, so I better go do fast. So that's the explanation of action. All you have is mental states, recollection, interest, consideration, willful effort, vital energy, and that's what leads to bodily action. And so Vasubandhu's point is, what does the self have to do here? There's no work for the self. Next slide. So what the previous slide did is give you an explanation of action, but also give you a proof for the non-existence of the self. And the proof is based on the Abhidharma principle, which you can think of as to be causally efficacious. If you have to accept that something exists, you must be able to show what that something does. It needs to have some causal beef. We won't accept the existence of anything if it's not doing anything in the causal explanation. That's an Abhidharma principle. So Vasubandhu makes a joke in the text about the self. He says, you think of the self like a quack doctor, who's just chanting the mantras while it is the herbs that are doing the work of the healing. The drama and the chanting doesn't do any work. That's the self. It's like just the chanting doesn't do any work. And so he thinks there is no reason to postulate a self independent of the mental and physical states. All we need for an explanation of action is mental and physical states. Next slide. So there is two points I want to bring your attention to. One, the mental and physical states are impermanent, and this is where we get the problem with at least the tension with the doctrine of karma. Those mental states are not going to hang around for when I'm going to be caught and punished. And two, that causal relations are ubiquitous. So the idea is this, if what binds me to my future, if you want to say, well, here's an explanation of responsibility that we can give, your states now will cause future states, future bundles of what we might call the Monima bundle. Future mental and physical states in the Monima bundle will be caused by these states. And so there is a special relation. We trace that relation and we hold the later Monima bundle responsible for stealing the mango. The point here, I think, is that causal relations is not the kind of relation you only have with your future self or your future bundle. You have causal relations with everyone. I right now have causal relations with you guys in Taiwan because when I'm saying things, it is causing mental states. I'm hoping very much it is causing mental states to come up. You're thinking about the sorts of things she's saying, right? You're looking at me. And that is causing mental states. You're looking at the slides. That's making you think about various things. There's looks of puzzlement. There is questions arising in your head and so on. So causal relations are all over the place. I don't just have causal relations to just my future states. I have causal relations with Kai and Kevin here and all of you in Taiwan. So one thing I think that Vasubandhu's denial of the self amounts to, he's denying the identity over time. And he's denying that you can have unique and separate persons continuing over time. I'll make that point, clearer as we go along, because I think this is also Parfit's message. Next slide. So responsible agency. Very quickly, I just want to tell you, revise what is Vasubandhu's explanation of action. You have it in the middle sentence. It's that chain: recollection, interest, consideration, effort, energy, bodily action. Action for Vasubandhu has mental and physical components. He thinks the consideration, effort, and energy are all the mental components of action. And of course, the bodily action is the physical component. Next slide. And so Vasubandhu's point in the quote, remember, reconceptualize agent as the dominant cause of action. So what is the dominant cause? Whatever comes before consideration, effort, and energy. That's because that's the mental action. So it's the notion of interest. The question then is interest suitable to play the role of an agent? Think about this question. I'm not going to answer it now. We'll come back to it. Next slide. So that's Vasubandhu's theory. This is the standard theory of action. This is the most popular contemporary theory in the Stanford Encyclopedia. The article on agency talks about, the standard theory being influenced by Davidson in the 1963 paper on event cause. And here's this sentence, the first sentence on the slide is basically from this Stanford Encyclopedia. It says there's no independent agent. Agency is to be explained in terms of causally efficacious mental states and events. That's what is called the event causal theory. This smells like Vasubandhu's theory to me. You might think, well, Davidson is only interested in giving you a causal action. It's not talking about what it is to do an action for which we might be held morally responsible, but many contemporary moral theorists have taken this theory to be giving an account of responsible action. So one example is Michael Smith, who is at Princeton, a philosopher who does meta-ethics, very influenced by this approach. He says actions are bodily movements that are caused, and rationalized by an agent's desire for an end and a belief that moving her body in the relevant way will bring that end about. Next slide. So Michael is offering an explanation of action in terms of a belief-desire pair. Sounds to me very much like Vasubandhu. Smith says, okay, you might think that's just a causal explanation of action. We need to do something more to give you an explanation of responsible action. So he says, we'll add the common sense view. And the common sense view is this, that, standard theory, Davidson's theory says that the beliefs that you have, the beliefs that go into the explanation of action. Why did she go to the fridge? Because she was thirsty, because she wants to get a bottle of water out. The beliefs are sensitive to the available evidence about the means to desired ends. How can she satisfy her ends? She wanted to have the mango. She hasn't got any money, so she steals the mango, right? That's just the desire, and the belief explains my action. The further thing that Michael Smith adds to this in order to talk about responsible agency, morally responsible agency, is that our desires better be sensitive to judgments about what there is moral reason to do. Even if I have the desire to steal the mango, if that interest comes up, I have to procure the mango at any cost, I should revise this desire in the light of, hey, this is the wrong thing to do. I'm going to suffer the consequences. So he just says, next slide, for Michael Smith, responsible agency just piggybacks on responsible believing and desiring. One very important thinker, David Bellarmine, is very worried about this way of explaining agency. He says there's a problem with the standard theory. It leaves us agents. Beliefs and desires are always revisable. But when we think of agency, we're not thinking of just beliefs and desires. We are thinking of someone that can reflect on the beliefs and desires and think about what desires should I have? So any revisable desire, he thinks, cannot be what explains agency. So he postulates this meta desire, the desire to act in accordance with reason. That's the desire which can play the agent role. I don't think that works either. I think, Vasubandhu's explanation that it's just interest, or this sophisticated explanation from Bellarmine, is not going to make any difference. I think Hornsby is very right to complain. So this is Jennifer Hornsby's complaint. It's the same complaint. The standard theory leaves agents out. Her complaint is no compounding of mental states and events in the naturalistic picture from which human beings or persons are absent could constitute someone's doing something that she intentionally does. To explain intentional actions, you've got to put human beings or selves or persons back into the picture. And I think you might think, persons, what's the problem? Persons are totally respectable naturalistic entities, this sort of thing, which is flesh and blood and, lots of neurons. That's the important bit. You might think that's how we should think about persons, and we've got a very good explanation of what. But, to be honest, if the notion of person can address the no agent problem, then you've got to have a known reductive view of persons as agent causes, which cannot be, they have to be substantial things. They cannot be just mental and physical states. So Hornby's suggestion is go non-reductive on the notion of person. Don't reduce persons to mental and physical states. That won't do the job. And I want to hold on to this theme, because many people in contemporary philosophy say, "Oh, fine, we can come up with the theory of responsible agency. All we need is, appeal to Parfit's account." And I think that won't give you an answer to this problem. Let me explain why. Next slide. And this is the section on persons. Next slide. So there were ancient Buddhist Pudgalbadins, and there are many contemporary Buddhist philosophers who also favor this option. We posit persons as the kind of thing which can be the bearer of responsibility. Mark Sideritz does it, and I love Mark's work, but I disagree with him. With him, even Amber Carpenter tries to develop the Pudgalbadin approach. Vasubandhu simply rejects this option. His argument in chapter 9 of the Abhidharma Kosh is persons like self are merely conventional entities. They don't do a thing. Remember the Abhidharma principle, to be is to be causally efficacious. Tell me what persons do in the explanation of action, and then I will accept them as being morally responsible. If persons are this other thing, other than mental and physical states, the non-reducible persons, then they are not going to do anything. He just gave you a complete explanation of action in terms of that causal chain. What else is required? Vasubandhu says these are all mistaken views. We don't neither need selves nor persons, and that's the view I'm defending here. But I want to push a little bit against the Parfitians, people who appeal to Parfit, the contemporary philosophers, and say that, it's okay. And so next slide. I want to, say something about Parfit's reductionist view of persons. He says, on this reductionist view, persons do exist, but they only exist in the way nations exist. Persons are not, as we mistakenly believe, fundamental. This view is in this sense more impersonal. I mean, typical Parfit, very hard to work out what he's saying. They're not fundamental. This view is impersonal, but we accept persons. And what he wants to say is, this is in the 1984 Reasons and Persons, he says this impersonalist view that he has put forward, persons are like nations. They don't ultimately exist. They only exist as part of, they're conventional. They're kind of conventional entities, like the Buddhist wants to talk about them. Impersonalism, he says, in the 1984 book is consistent with the moderate claim and the extreme claim. Now, what the moderate claim says is, Monima, you want a responsible agent. You have a practical concern. Who is responsible? And okay, we don't have a non-reductive person to put responsibility on, but we can put it on what matters in personal identity. And what matters, as you might know, is the being you are psychologically connected and continuous with. So all we need is to say, our practical concerns are grounded by psychological continuity and connectedness. That's what gives you are psychologically connected to the one who stole the mango last June in India, and that's why you should be punished. But the extreme claim, and he, in Reasons and Persons, he moves between these two claims, and he says both are defensible. He doesn't give you a clear answer, just says any concerns about responsibility, any of our practical concerns about who should be held responsible, is left ungrounded. And so, next slide. So here is Parfit on the moderate claim. So he wants you to, consider this example. Suppose, when a convict is now less closely connected to himself at the time of the crime. So if I have been reformed greatly, it's because of Kevin and Kai being here. I have been reformed greatly, and I have given up any intentions of stealing or, doing this bad sorts of things I used to do. So you might say, there are psychological connections with my previous self, but now that I have a totally different reformed personality, the connections are very weak. I don't deserve any punishment for stealing that mango. This claim, Parfit says, treats a criminal's later self as a sane accomplice. I'd see what he's doing here. He's really, I think, questioning the separateness of persons. Insofar as we can be accomplices in crime, the kinds of reasons that led me to be beliefs, to form those beliefs and desires that, I have to have this mango, so I have to have this mango no matter what. So it's the kind of influences that led me to have those values, if you like. So he wants to question that, our later selves, I think, are like others. This is what he wants to say by the sane accomplice example. And persons are not really separate things. I mean, the responsibility theorists, want to say that desert corresponds to the degree of psychological connectedness. But I think Parfit is really questioning the separateness of persons. Next slide. So, what responsibility theorists these days, so David Shoemaker, try to run with, claims like this, say, just bring in the moderate claim, and it offers us a way to sidestep concerns about identity. We don't have personal identity over time. Parfit is right about that. But we can say some past action A is attributable to a person Y. So my action of stealing the mango is attributable to me for purposes of responsibility, just in case I now am I'm psychologically continuous with the agent who did A's action. But the question I think worth raising, from a Buddhist perspective and from a Parfitian perspective is there a unique and a separate entity that is psychologically continuous with me? And in order to make the point in the context of responsibility, Parfit uses this other example. Next slide. So here's Parfit's other example of a Nobel Peace Prize winner who, when winning the prize at age 90, makes the speech at the podium. I'm the one, when I was 20, a university student, I hurt a policeman, in fact, injured him very badly. So the piece, when he's getting his prize, he confesses what he did when he was a university student at 20. This is what Parfit says about this. Though this was a serious crime, this man may not now deserve to be punished. This man has done a lot since then, for promoting peace in the world. We may be tempted to protest, but someone might protest. But it was just as much his crime. This is true, Parfit says, and this truth would be a good objection if we were not reductionists. If we are reductionist about persons, if we reduce persons to mental and physical states, then the question, is this the same person, loses significance. You don't have an answer to this question. Is it her? Is it the same woman who stole the mango last year? This question has no meaning, Parfit says. It loses significance. The uniqueness assumption needs to go. So I think reductionists are very much, all reductionists in contemporary philosophy are faced with the problem that the Buddhists are faced with, and Parfit openly accepts it in his later book. Next slide. He, again, in the 2011 on What Matters, Parfit's later work, he clearly endorses the extreme claim. This is what he says: if our acts are merely events in time, we could not deserve to suffer. Our acts are merely events in time, we cannot deserve to suffer. So Parfit's conclusion is no one deserves to suffer or to be rewarded. And the focus is because there is no one. You can't pick out a person and say she is responsible. Once you go reductionist, you don't have a hold on unique and separate persons. That's the problem. And I think everyone has to face it. So who is responsible? Keep going. That question remains. I want to give you Vasubandhu's answer. Vasubandhu says, when he thinks about karmic responsibility in the last chapter of Abhidharma Kosh Bhashya, he says, so think of karma using the agricultural analogy. Certain seed, so if you think of the action as the seed, and you think of, the result of the action in after a long period of time as the fruit. So the seed becomes the plant and, takes a long time. We do not say that the fruit arises from the exhausted seeds because the action has been and gone, but we say from the distinctive feature of the transformation of the continuum, like seed and fruit. So what happens is that the series of mental and physical states that continues to be transformed on account of the action, bad action, the kind of series you will have in the future. The kind of series that will be, the kind of series of mental and physical states that you'll develop to be is going to be affected by the quality of the seed. So he goes on to say, for if that seed did not proceed, then there would not be a capacity to arise a fruit of that sort. Plant a mango seed, you get a mango tree if you're lucky. You plant a mango seed, you're not going to get a rice field. That's not going to happen. So depending on the action, good result, bad action, bad result. In the earlier text, he uses the seed metaphor to explain this, but then later on, people worry because the Abhidharma are really momentaries. So they think only things in the present exist, and other Buddhist school raise questions. So he even uses the perfume metaphor, and I kind of like that. If you do a bad action, it kind of leaves a bad smell around. Think of bad action in that kind of way, leaves a bad smell around, and that's going to have an effect on the kind of way your continuum is going to evolve from then on. Do a good action and you're perfumed. It's beautiful, it's joyous, all the good things. Next slide. So I think what Vasubandhu is saying is, there is no identity between the agent and agent of action and the bearer of responsibility. And, if we posit any such identity, then that will be totally arbitrary and perhaps even immoral. Because, if it's not the same person, what basis do you have for saying that I should suffer because I stole the mango last year? I am now so reformed because of these good people that I think I don't deserve to be. And especially, when we are talking about across lifetimes in the Buddhist context, the psychological connections are very weak and the temporal gaps are huge. And you might think, this is just Vasubandhu's problem because he has these commitments to momentariness and rebirth. I don't think that is right. Mark Johnston, who Kai's hero, is said in a paper in 2016 on Personites. He makes exactly the same problem. He says all our ethical practices have a singularity problem. I gave this talk at Princeton, and he told me about his paper. All the ethical theories have this singularity assumption, and if you have a reductive view of persons, then you cannot satisfy the singularity assumption. Next slide. I'll be doing time by 6:15. Yeah, okay. So this, I think, is a challenge of modern responsible agency, and it's not just Vasubandhu's problem. I think all contemporary philosophers who take the reductionist view are faced by this problem. So the problem arises for any event causal view. No one deserves to be praised and rewarded. I think me and Vasubandhu and Parfit are on the same page, and reductionists therefore have to rethink their responsibility practice, or the Buddhists must rethink the notion of karma. Next slide. And, someone might say, what kind of revisionism? And some contemporary philosophers, again, I'll use David Shoemaker, because I was at Cornell last year and I said, if my challenge is correct, what kinds of revisions are warranted? And his response was, calm down, Monima, we don't need to do anything. We just take the normative turn following Strawson, the famous paper, Freedom and Resentment, and all your metaphysical qualms can be set aside. We don't have to worry about it. Our interpersonal responsibility practices are sacrosanct and immune to revision, and they're impervious to metaphysical doctrines. If you remember Strawson, the metaphysical doctrine he's worried about is determinism. If determinism is true, what happens about blaming people? What happens about us getting angry? And Strawson says, don't worry about it. Irrespective of the truth of determinism, our practices are safe because, next slide, because he says, anyone who raises this question about if determinism is true, how do we justify? What is the rational justification of our ordinary practices? Strawson just says, such a question could seem real to someone who has missed the point. It is the fact of our natural human commitment to our interpersonal attitudes. This commitment is part of the general framework of human life, not something that can come up for review. And so that's what I want to question. Why our practice is not the sort of thing that can come up for review. We often get things wrong, right? Our practices can be wrong. Next slide. And then he goes on to say, and second, imagine is even if we could imagine what we cannot have, that is a choice in this matter. That is, choosing not to follow these practices. We could rationally choose only in the light of gains and losses to human life. So he's kind of saying we have no choice in this matter. Why is it psychologically impossible to reconsider our practices and reactive attitudes? Why should we agree with Strawson that our practices are not up for change? It's okay, he says, to get angry. The Buddhist, the Buddhist saying we have to get rid of anger once and for all is not going to make any difference to Strawson. He says, you have no choice in this matter. And, it's psychologically impossible for you. Don't even try. And I think something's got to be wrong here. But he does say, okay, if you think we need to reconsider our reactive attitudes, our normal human reactions, we need to look at gains and losses to human life. And so next slide, I want to say, I think it's just wrong that it is psychologically impossible for us. These are empirical claims about human nature. And Strawson from the armchair has no business to say that, people just cannot give up on responsibility practices. Many Buddhist monks, I am sure, have given up on anger. And, there is also some anthropological evidence that Jean Briggs in 1970, there's a lovely little book called Never in Anger. It's about a tribe, the First Nations tribe in Canada. And those people just don't have the anger response, no matter what the situation. Also, it is worth pointing out, this is currently a very famous anthropologist. She says, D. Leah Snyder, that cultural variation in emotion is not only a difference in the expression of attitudes. It's not just that, individualistic cultures express anger and we don't. Some, collective cultures don't. It's just very utterance of those attitudes. Those things are taught rather than, something we are born with. So we need to worry about these kinds of claims. Next slide. And in terms of gains and losses to human life, there is some evidence to think that, not only that our lives will be greatly diminished if we gave up on responsibility practices. In fact, Dirk Pereboom, who is also at Cornell, he says our lives will go much better. We can replace these reactive attitudes by what he calls non-basic deserty surrogates. I mean, that is so philosophical. I hate that long term. I don't even want to talk about what that might mean. I'll just give you an example. Anger, he thinks, can be replaced by something like moral protest and sadness. Now, I'll leave you to think about, whether this will do the work of anger or not. But think about the Buddhists. The Buddhist also says, Here's a metaphysical strategy, for example, Buddha Gosha says, if you get angry at someone, here's a way of dissolving your anger. I mean, let's suppose Kai is so nice, he never does anything that I get angry at him. But if I were to get angry at him, I could, just look at him and say, is it the nose I'm angry at? Or is it his shirt? Or is it, the hair on his head? Or is it his mental state? What is it that I'm angry at? And then kind of anger goes away, right? It's with the hand with which he did something, he's writing all the stuff. Should I get angry at his hand that's been typing away? The anger kind of disappears when we, break down a person into states. Next slide. And Shoemaker and Sean Nichols and David Shoemaker have a paper which is forthcoming and says, they talk about a lot of benefits, lots of gains. If we take the reductionist view, fear of death is reduced. And Parfit himself says this thought is liberating, it is consoling. Also, there is some indication that those who take the reductionist view, who are convinced by the Parfitian kind of cases, they seem to be more charitable when it comes to giving. And also, there is empirical evidence to think that, reducing a belief in the persisting self, if there is no self, that deflates our punitive attitudes. We tend to punish other people less. So I think these are all good things. And so, if we look at the gains, it's worth changing our attitudes. Next slide. So I think I have established there is some room for revisionism. I won't say more about it because we are, I've taken up quite a bit of time. So there is some room for revisionism. The last question I want to ask is, what kind of revision? Next slide. What kind of revision should we make to our responsibility practices following the Buddhists? And this is what the Buddhists, this is what I think the Buddhists might say. What the Abhidharma Buddhists say is they recommend a fine-grained and a discerning approach that targets undercutting some of our negative reactive attitudes, not all of them. So they say get rid of anger, resentment, guilt, and shame, and you keep these positive ones: love, gratitude, forgiveness, praise, and compassion. These are the ones we should keep. The negative ones we should get rid of. Why should we get rid of the negative ones? Well, they're tied to the Buddhist goal of reducing suffering, and the recommended method, if I understand the Abhidharma right, involves both knowledge and meditation. So they think all of the bad in the world is because of the illusion, is tied to the illusion of the self. And, once you get rid of that illusion, then you can get rid of these really, bad dharmas that are deeply part of your psychology. I'm not arguing for that. I'm not saying this belief in the self is the cause of all the bad in the world. I'm not even saying that those methods work for everyone. Rather, what I want to say, next slide, is this, that what Vasubandhu is recommending is that there is a new object for moral evaluation and moral betterment. If we want to make ourselves better, if we want to make the world better, we should think of states as impersonally conceived rather than whole persons or selves. Rather than fixing, the problem with Chris or the problem with Kai, I should think of, what can we do about Kai's anger? What can we do about Chris's belligerence? I'm just making it up. Forgive me. So that's how I think we should revise our practices. And the Buddhist thinks very much like Parfit, that change in beliefs about personal identity should penetrate deep. It not only changes our beliefs, it changes our non-rational emotions, attitude, cares, values. In fact, all the action guiding stuff in our psychology needs to change so that we become, we just naturally become people who do better things. Last slide. So here's my, current progress, work in progress, is looking at each of the reactive attitudes And what I'm suggesting is you need to do two kinds of work. What I'm trying to do right now is you need further conceptual work to reconceive some of the positive reactive attitudes. Because think about love and compassion. They're also person-directed. Think about gratitude. That's person-directed. So if what we need is thinking about the reactive attitudes in without having a commitment to persons in a no self, no person ontology, then we need some conceptual work to rethink these reactive attitudes. And I think, we can think of gratitude, we can think of guilt and shame in that kind of way. That's some of the work I've done. And then I think there's a further empirical question with each of these things, with each of these negative reactive attitudes. Is anger, is eliminating anger really the right way to go? I think we need to establish that. There is, as you know, live debate in contemporary philosophy that we should not eliminate all kinds of anger. So again, I want to look more closely at is eliminating anger the right thing to do. All I want to say here, at least the Buddhist gives us a new way of thinking about how we might do better, a new way of reconceiving our responsibility practices. It's not just person directed, and that's the end of it. That's all I'll say. Thank you very much for your time. I think I'm done. Thank you. Thank you.